Not one person attended Nellie Treadwell's funeral except the mail carrier and the pastor. The mail carrier came because he had known her for 22 years and felt it was the right thing to do. The pastor came because it was his job. Neither of them stayed long. The county sent Maggie Holloway 3 weeks later. She was 68 years old and had spent 41 years in the Bucks County Land Records Office, the kind of career that left a specific mark on a person, the mark of someone who had learned to read documents the way other people read faces. She had retired 3 years earlier and had been living quietly in Doylestown when the county called and asked if she would handle a special case. No known heirs. A farmhouse that needed to be inventoried before the estate sale. She had said yes because she did not have a reason to say no. She pulled up to the Treadwell farm on a December morning and sat in the truck for a moment looking at the house through the windshield. White clapboard, 2 stories, the paint gone to gray and brown over decades of Pennsylvania winters. The porch sagging at the east end, the fence along the road laid down in sections. A sign nailed to the porch post, estate sale. No heirs. She had seen this before. She had seen it many times. She got out of the truck and went inside. The kitchen was the first room she worked through, not because it was the logical starting point, but because it told her the most in the least time. The kitchen of a person who lived alone said everything about how that person had managed the last years of their life. Nellie Treadwell's kitchen said careful, economical, not unhappy. The dishes were clean and stacked. The table was cleared except for a piece of cloth and a needle and thread, still in position, as if Nellie had set down her mending and expected to return to it. Maggie worked through the cabinets. Canning jars most empty. A few tins of soup expired. A coffee mug with a chip on the rim that had been kept anyway. She opened the pantry door. Shelves along 3 walls, the wood worn smooth from decades of use. Old spice tins, the labels faded. A row of preserves, the lids rusted at the edges. Cobwebs in the upper corners. She worked from top to bottom, moving items to examine the shelves behind them, making notes in the inventory folder. On the second shelf from the bottom, near the back right corner, she reached behind a row of empty mason jars, and her fingers found something cold and slightly rough. A loose brick. She pressed it gently. It shifted the mortar around it, long since crumbled to powder, the brick held in place by nothing but friction and the weight of the shelving. She worked it out carefully and set it on the shelf. Behind it, in a hollow, perhaps 8 inches deep, a can. Maxwell House Coffee, the large size. The label still partially legible, despite the rust that had consumed most of the surface. The familiar red and gold colors gone brown, the lettering visible in patches. The lid had rusted to the body of the can in a continuous seal of oxidation. She lifted it with both hands. Too heavy for an empty can, much too heavy. She turned it carefully, listening, not the granular shift of coffee, paper, the soft compression of folded paper shifting inside a metal container. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. She tried the lid with her fingers first. It did not move. She went to the drawer where Nellie kept her kitchen tools and found a short knife with a worn handle and worked the blade around the rim of the lid, breaking the rust seal in sections, working patiently, the way she had learned to work with fragile documents, never forcing, always patient, giving the material time to yield on its own terms. The lid came free. Inside paper folded with care, the folds crisp despite the years. The top sheet was parchment weight, the kind used for legal documents. She unfolded it on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with both hands. The language of the document was the formal English of early 20th century legal instruments, the kind of language she had read 10,000 times in 41 years of land records work. This indenture made the 14th day of April in the year of our Lord 1927. She read down the page, the property description, the acreage, the county, the name of the grantor, the name of the grantee. At the bottom of the final page, in the space reserved for the principal party's signature, Silas Treadwell, and below the signature, 340 acres, Upper Bucks County, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The county seal impressed into the paper, the notary's signature, the recording officer's stamp. She held the document in both hands and looked at it in the winter light from the kitchen window. She reached back into the can. A bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, the paper slightly yellowed but intact. 7 envelopes, the handwriting on each one in the same deliberate hand addressed to Miss Nellie Treadwell. She set the letters on the table beside the deed. Silas Treadwell had died in 1952. The farmhouse had been occupied by Nellie Treadwell from that year until her death in 2007. 55 years. And in the wall of the pantry, behind a loose brick and a coffee can, rusted shut the original deed to 340 acres of Upper Bucks County farmland had been sitting undisturbed. If the deed was here, in this can, in this wall, then where was the deed the county had been recording transactions against for the past 75 years? Maggie looked at the kitchen, at the mending on the table, at the chipped mug on the shelf. She thought about Nellie Treadwell, 87 years old, no heirs, no visitors, a funeral attended by a mail carrier and a pastor. She thought about the sign on the porch post. She thought about the loose brick and the can and the carefully folded deed inside it. She said quietly to the empty kitchen, Silas Treadwell died in 1952. This is the original deed for all of the Treadwell land. But if it has been here all this time, then who has been living on whose land? She drove to the Treadwell farm on a Tuesday morning in November. The county had given her a single-page assignment sheet and a set of keys, and the standard form for estate inventory, the same form she had used dozens of times in her last years at the records office when properties came into county possession without heirs. She had filled out the top section the night before Treadwell Nellie. Deceased November 3, 2007, no known next of kin, property farmhouse and outbuildings Upper Bucks County, purpose of inventory assess contents prior to estate sale. She had not known Nellie Treadwell. In 41 years of working the land records for Bucks County, she had processed transactions involving the Treadwell parcel 3 times, a boundary confirmation in 1978, a tax abatement filing in 1989, and a routine property assessment in 2001, but she had never met the woman who lived there. The name in the records was always Treadwell Nellie E., single owner, no mortgage taxes current. A woman who paid her taxes on time and did not generate paperwork was not a woman who attracted attention. Maggie parked at the end of the drive and sat for a moment. The house was 2 stories, white clapboard, the paint worn to gray and brown in the places where the wood had expanded and contracted through too many Pennsylvania winters without maintenance. The porch sagged at the east end, the boards soft with moisture damage, the railing gone on one side. A kitchen garden along the south foundation, the beds still marked by the stones Nellie had used to define them, the last summer's growth dead and flattened by the first frosts. The sign was nailed to the porch post. Estate sale. No heirs. She had seen that sign before on other properties. It always struck her the same way, not as a legal notice, but as a kind of biography condensed to 3 words. A whole life. And this was what remained of it in the public record. She got out of the truck and went inside. She started upstairs the way she had always started the personal rooms first, because they told you the most about the person who had lived there, and understanding the person made the rest of the inventory go better. Nellie's bedroom was at the top of the stairs. Small, the ceiling sloped on the west side, where the roof came down the window looking out over the front drive. An iron bed, single the frame painted white, and the paint worn silver at the rails, where hands had gripped it over decades of getting in and getting out. The mattress, thin, the springs visible at the edges. A quilt folded at the foot, the kind made from salvaged fabric. The patches irregular, the work careful. On the nightstand, a Bible worn at the spine. A pair of reading glasses folded and set on the open page. She looked at the page without touching the book. Isaiah 41:10. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. She wrote it in her inventory notes, not because it was an item with monetary value, because it was information. The sewing room next, which had once been a second bedroom but had been converted at some point in the last 30 years, the bed removed and the space given over entirely to the work that had apparently been Nellie's primary occupation. A Singer treadle machine, the cast iron still solid, the cabinet worn smooth. A work table covered in organized clutter spools of thread arranged by color, a pincushion bristling with needles, a basket of mending. On top of the basket, a man's work shirt, the collar fraying a needle and thread still in position where Nellie had set it down. She had set it down as if she expected to return. Maggie stood in the doorway of the sewing room and looked at the shirt with the needle in it for a moment. Then she wrote it down and went downstairs. The parlor, a wingback chair with the fabric worn through at the armrests, a small side table, a lamp, a bookcase with perhaps 30 volumes. The bookcase held what Nellie had read across a lifetime, a Bible concordance, a volume of Robert Frost, several agricultural almanacs from the 1960s and 1970s, a handful of library books with their spines still readable, returned date stamps visible in the front covers. A woman who read, who kept the books that mattered to her and returned the ones that did not. The kitchen lass. The kitchen of a person who lived alone for many decades developed a specific character, everything organized for efficiency, nothing duplicated, the working surfaces reduced to what was actually used. Nellie's kitchen was this: a 4-burner range, 1 burner, clearly the primary one, the others less used. A single pot, a single skillet, both well seasoned. A mug on the draining rack with a chip on the rim that had been kept anyway because it still held coffee. Maggie opened the cabinets, noted the contents in her inventory: canning jars, mostly empty, several tins of soup, dates expired, a box of crackers, the wax liner intact, a half-used bag of flour hardened through the paper from moisture, unusable. She opened the pantry door. Shelves along 3 walls, the pine boards worn smooth from decades of contact with tins and jars and hands reaching in and pulling back. The upper shelves held old spice tins and a few glass bottles with handwritten labels from what had been a more productive kitchen: preserved tomatoes, apple butter dates from the 1980s. The lower shelves held the working supplies: a few remaining cans, a box of salt, a bag of dried beans. She worked shelf by shelf, moving items to check what was behind them. On the second shelf from the bottom, she shifted a row of empty mason jars to reach the back of the shelf. Her fingers touched the wall. She pressed automatically, the habit of 41 years of checking behind things in places where things were hidden. The wall surface moved. She pressed again, more deliberately. Not the wall, a brick. A single brick set in the pantry wall at the back of the second shelf that shifted inward under her fingertips with the particular ease of something that had been moved before. The mortar around it had crumbled to powder at some point in the past decades, and the brick now sat in its opening, held by nothing but its own weight, fitting the space the way a key fits a lock. She worked it out carefully. Behind it, a hollow in the wall, perhaps 8 inches deep, and inside the hollow, sitting on the brick ledge, as if it had been set there with care, a tin can. Maxwell House, coffee, the large size. The surface rusted to a uniform brown, the label still partially visible beneath the oxidation, the familiar red and gold, the words, "good to the last drop," legible in one section where the rust had not yet consumed the printing entirely. She lifted it with both hands. Too heavy. Not the weight of an empty can, not even the weight of old coffee grounds settling in the bottom. The weight of something dense and compact, packed inside. She tilted it gently. The sound that came from inside was not the granular shift of powder or the liquid movement of anything wet. Paper. The soft, specific compression of folded paper shifting inside a metal container. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down in the single chair that remained. The other chairs had been removed at some point, their absence marked by the wear pattern on the linoleum, and this one chair remained because it was the chair Nellie had always used. She tried the lid. It did not move. The rust had fused the seam into a continuous joint of oxidized metal. She went to the kitchen drawer where Nellie kept her tools and found a short knife with a black handle, the blade worn from decades of use. She worked the blade around the rim of the lid, breaking the rust seal section by section, applying steady pressure and releasing it and applying it again, patient and methodical, the way she had always worked with things that required patience. The lid came free with a dry metallic sound. She tilted the can over the table. Folded paper, cream-colored and slightly yellow with age, slid onto the table surface. Several pieces, the folds crisp and deliberate. And beneath the folded paper, held against the bottom of the can by the weight of the paper, above a bundle of envelopes tied with kitchen twine, the paper of the envelopes the same aged cream as the folded sheets. She unfolded the top sheet. The weight and texture of parchment, the typeface of a legal document from the early 20th century. She read the opening line. This indenture made the 14th day of April in the year of our Lord 1927. She read through the property description, the metes and bounds notation she had read thousands of times in 41 years, the acreage, the county. She turned to the final page. The Bucks County seal impressed into the paper at the lower left, the notary's signature and commission number, the recording officer's stamp with the date of filing, and in the space reserved for the principal party, Silas Treadwell. Signed in a careful, deliberate hand, the signature of a man who understood the weight of what he was signing. Below the signature, 340 acres. Upper Bucks County, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Maggie sat in Nellie Treadwell's kitchen chair with the original deed to 340 acres in her hands. She knew the Treadwell parcel. She had worked its records for 4 decades. She knew which portions of the original parcel had been transferred to adjacent landowners over the years, which families had built on what had once been Treadwell land, which deeds recorded in the county office traced their chain of title back to transactions involving this property. She knew who was living on parts of this land. Whitfield, Carver, Driscoll, 3 families, 3 properties, 3 chains of title that ran through transactions dating to the 1930s. And she knew with the certainty of 41 years of reading land records that a properly executed and filed original deed took precedence over any subsequent transaction that contradicted it. She looked at the bundle of letters on the table, the twine around them, the handwriting on the envelopes. She looked at the hollow in the pantry wall where the can had been waiting. Nellie Treadwell had walked past that pantry wall every day for 58 years. She had known the can was there. She had left it there. She had lived out the full remainder of her life in this house with the original deed to her family's land hidden behind a brick in her pantry wall, and she had died with it still there, and she had told no one. Maggie sat with that for a long moment. Then she picked up the letters. She spread the letters on the kitchen table in the order they had come out of the can. 7 envelopes, the paper aged to the particular cream of documents stored in dry conditions for a long time. The twine that had held them together was kitchen twine, the practical kind that came on a ball and was used for everything on a working farm, dried now to a brittleness that crumbled slightly when she untied it. She set the twine aside and opened the first envelope. The handwriting inside was deliberate and careful, the hand of a man who had not written many letters and understood that the ones he did write needed to be legible. The ink had faded to brown, but remained fully readable in the kitchen's winter light. September 17th, 1931. Nellie, dear, I am writing this letter and will keep it with the original deed in the coffee can. If you are reading this, it means I am no longer here to explain things myself. Last month I discovered that August Whitfield, Raymond Carver, and Lester Driscoll hired the same survey engineer, a man named Edgar Poole, out of Doylestown to redraw their boundary lines. Poole's survey shifted the shared boundary an additional 30 feet onto our land along the full length of the eastern line. He did the same on the southern and western lines. The total comes to 87 acres of Treadwell land, absorbed into their holdings on paper. I went to see each of them. August said it was a surveying error and he would correct it. He did not correct it. Raymond said I was imagining things. Lester threatened to sue me for slander if I said another word about it to anyone in the township. I have no money for a lawyer. You know this, we barely had enough for seed this year. So I am doing the only thing I can do. I am keeping the original deed. I am not filing it with the court because the court charges fees I do not have. But I am not destroying it either. I am keeping it until someone can use it. Maggie set the letter down and picked up the second one. March 1932. The handwriting slightly smaller than the first letter, more compressed, as if Silas had understood by then that he was writing for the long term and needed to use the paper carefully. Raymond Carver put up new fence posts along the south line today. The fence sits 40 feet inside our property. I watched from the kitchen window. I did not say anything. I just stood there and watched. She read through the sequence. November 1934. Silas returning from Lester Driscoll's funeral. Every man in the township came. They called him a pillar of the community. Nobody knew. Not one person in that church knew. May 1941. August Whitfield arriving at the farm and offering $300 for 20 acres of the eastern parcel, the land that was already recorded as his on the county survey. Silas refusing, August asking why, Silas saying because it is not yours to buy. August's face going white, August leaving without another word. Maggie sat with the 1941 letter for a moment. There was something in that exchange that she recognized the particular, compressed dignity of a man who had been stripped of every legal and financial tool available to him and had kept the one thing that could not be taken, the knowledge of what was true. He had not said, "I have the deed." He had said, "It is not yours to buy." He had stood on that ground figuratively, since the ground itself had been taken from him on paper, and he had said the accurate thing. And Whitfield had known. The white face, the silence, the departure without another word. Whitfield had known. She opened the final letter. June 1947. The handwriting was different from the earlier letters, still Silas's hand. The letter forms the same, but the pressure uneven, some letters larger than those around them, the line of the writing drifting slightly from the ruled margin. The hand of someone writing with diminished physical control, but undiminished intention. Nellie, the doctor says my heart is weak. A few months, maybe. I am giving you the coffee can tonight. You asked what was inside it. I told you the truth. But you have to promise me one thing. Do not open it until you are ready, and do not tell anyone you have it until you find someone who can help you use it. I know this is a burden, but I have no one else to trust with it. You are the last Treadwell Nellie. What you do with these papers will decide whether the Treadwell name means anything on this land anymore. I cannot give you money. I cannot give you back the land that was taken. But I can give you the truth. It is worth nothing to anyone who does not know how to read it. You will know what to do. I love you. Be strong, Father. Maggie read the last paragraph twice. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and set it on the table beside the others. 6 letters spanning 16 years. Not complaints, not laments, reports. Silas Treadwell had been keeping a record the same way the Land Records Office kept a record because he understood that unrecorded history had no weight. The letters were the weight. She looked out the kitchen window. The fields beyond the glass were covered in the thin November snow that had fallen overnight, the fence lines and the tree lines marking the boundaries of what had once been the full Treadwell parcel. In the distance, perhaps a quarter mile, the roof line of the Whitfield property was visible above the tree line, the house that had been expanded and improved across 4 generations on land that the original deed in front of her described as belonging to Silas Treadwell. The chimney was smoking. Someone was home. She turned back to the table and looked at the empty coffee can, the lid beside it, the 7 letters in their neat sequence, the deed folded on top. The deed that Silas had not been able to use, that Nellie had kept for 58 years behind a brick in her pantry wall, that Nellie had carried as a weight, a possibility, a promise she had been given and had not found the means to fulfill for the rest of her life. She said very quietly to the empty kitchen, "Nellie, you kept this for 58 years. Why did you never tell anyone?" The kitchen did not answer, but the letters on the table said everything Silas had been able to say. And the emptiness of the house, the mending on the table upstairs, the single chair at the kitchen table, the chipped mug on the draining rack said everything Nellie had not. She drove to the County Historical Library the following morning. She brought the coffee can in her bag, not because she needed it for the research, but because she was not yet ready to leave it anywhere. 41 years of handling original documents had given her a specific instinct about custody of evidence, and the instinct said, keep it close until you understand what you have. The historical library occupied the 2nd floor of the county administration building, a room she had visited perhaps a dozen times over her career when a land dispute required historical context. The archivist on duty was a young man she did not recognize, a replacement for the woman who had held the position for 20 years before her, who had retired the same year Maggie had. She showed her county inventory credentials and asked for the Treadwell property file and the township meeting records from 1947 through 1970. He brought 4 boxes. She put on her archive gloves and began. The property tax records were the first thing she pulled. Nellie Treadwell, taxpayer of record from 1952, the year Silas died, through 2007. 55 years of annual tax payments, each one filed on time, each one for the assessed value of 253 acres. 253 acres. The original deed in her bag documented 340 acres. The difference was 87 acres, the exact figure Silas had written in his first letter in 1931. She looked at the payment method recorded in the tax records. Every year, without exception, money order. Purchased at the Buckingham Township Post Office, the payment method of someone who did not have a checking account or who preferred that no bank record exist of the transaction. She had seen this pattern before in her records work. It was the payment method of people who lived at the edge of the formal economy, who managed their financial lives in cash and in careful person-to-person transactions because the institutional alternatives required resources they did not have. Nellie had paid every tax bill on time for 55 years on what remained of her family's land using money orders bought at the post office, probably with money earned from the mending she did for neighbors who may or may not have paid her what the work was worth. Maggie wrote the figures in her notepad. She pulled the grocery receipts next, not because they were in the county records, but because Henderson's General Store had donated its ledgers to the Historical Society when it closed in 1991, a common practice among longtime county businesses, and the archivist had mentioned the collection when she explained what she was researching. Nellie Treadwell appeared in the Henderson's ledger every week from 1953 through 1991, the full span of the store's operation after Silas died. The same items week after week: flour, sugar, tea, cat food. The total varied by only a few cents across 4 decades of inflation, which meant that what Nellie bought each week was exactly what she needed, and nothing more. The cat food was the one variable the quantity changed over the years: more when there were more cats, less when there were fewer. Maggie sat with the Hendersons' ledger for a moment. She thought about the kitchen at the Treadwell farm, the single pot, the single skillet, the chipped mug kept because it still held coffee, the mending basket with the needles still in the cloth. She pulled the township meeting minutes. The records for 1955 were in the 3rd box. She found the relevant session in October of that year, a regular township meeting, the agenda, including a proposal by August Whitfield Jr. to widen the access road to the Whitfield property. The road in question ran along what the county survey recorded as the boundary between the Whitfield and Treadwell parcels. The vote 7 in favor, 1 opposed. The one opposed, Nellie E. Treadwell. She had been at the meeting, had sat in a room with the son of the man who had helped take 87 acres of her family's land, had heard him propose to improve his access to that land, and had cast the single opposing vote. No record of any statement made by her, no record of any objection raised beyond the vote itself. She had been there. She had registered her opposition in the only way the system gave her a single vote that changed nothing. Maggie set the township minutes aside and went to the 4th box, County Court Correspondence 1960 through 1970. She found it near the back of the 2nd folder. A single sheet, the paper the same aged cream as Silas's letters. The handwriting different from Silas's, smaller, more careful, the hand of someone who did not write letters often and was being very precise about this one. Dated March 14, 1963. To the Honorable Court Clerk of Bucks County, I am writing to ask about the procedure for filing an original deed in order to contest a boundary survey conducted in 1931. I have the original deed for the Treadwell property in Upper Bucks County, dated 1927. I believe the surveys conducted by Edgar Poole in 1931 are inconsistent with this deed. I would like to understand what it would cost to bring this matter before the court and what documentation I would need to provide. Respectfully, Nellie E. Treadwell, Buckingham Township. At the top of the letter, in the red ink of an official stamp, Received. March 17, 1963. Bucks County Court of Common Pleas. She turned the letter over. Nothing on the back. She looked through the rest of the folder for a response. Nothing. She went through the adjacent folders. Nothing filed under Treadwell in the court correspondence for 1963 or 1964 or any subsequent year. The letter had been received, stamped, filed, and never answered. Maggie sat with the unanswered letter in her gloved hands. She had worked in the records office from 1966 onward. She had not been there in 1963, but the office had not changed much between 1963 and 1966. The same filing systems, the same procedures, probably many of the same staff. If Nellie's letter had arrived while Maggie was working there, a letter from a woman in a gray wool sweater asking about the cost of contesting an old survey, asking carefully and politely because she was not a person with resources to spend on legal proceedings, would it have been answered? Maggie sat in the quiet reading room of the County Historical Library and looked at the unanswered letter and did not answer her own question. In the back of the fourth box, she found the photograph, a contact sheet from the 1964 county fair donated by the local newspaper when it closed. 50 small images, the people in them identifiable by the captions typed on a separate sheet. She found the caption for image 37, Nellie Treadwell, Buckingham Township at the baked goods table. She looked at the image through the magnifying glass the reading room provided. A woman, perhaps 44 years old in 1964, standing at the edge of a table covered with baked goods. Gray wool sweater, the fabric thick, the kind of sweater made for warmth rather than appearance. A handbag held close against her body with both hands, the grip of someone who had something in the bag she was not going to put down. Her face turned slightly toward the camera, not posed, caught between one moment and the next. Not smiling, not unhappy, simply present with the particular quality of presence that belonged to people who had learned to exist in rooms without drawing attention to themselves, who had made a practice of being there without being seen. Maggie looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about the coffee can, about the loose brick, about the careful placement of the deed, and the letters in a container that would survive decades, about the unanswered letter of 1963, about 55 years of money orders at the post office and $12 a week at Henderson's, and a single opposing vote at a township meeting in 1955. Nellie Treadwell had known exactly what was in that coffee can. She had tried once to use it, had written a careful and precise letter to the county court, and had received no reply. And then she had gone back to the farm and gone back to her mending and gone back to her $12 a week at Henderson's and had continued for 44 more years to walk past the pantry wall where the can sat behind the brick. Not because she had given up, because she had no way to go further alone and no one had ever offered to go with her. Maggie closed the box. She sat for a moment in the reading room. Then she stood and gathered her coat and her bag and walked out of the library into the gray November afternoon. She stood on the sidewalk and took out her phone. She dialed. "The line connected Bucks County Land Records Office. How can I help you?" Maggie paused for 1 second, not from uncertainty, from the particular steadying that comes before you say the thing that commits you to what comes next. She said, "This is Margaret Holloway. I worked in your office for 41 years. I need to speak with someone about the original Treadwell deed from 1927. Nellie kept that deed for 58 years and tried to use it exactly once in 1963 before falling silent forever, but she never threw it away. And now Maggie Holloway is about to do what Nellie could not, subscribe to see 3 family lines rewritten. She did not file the deed immediately. 41 years in the Land Records Office had given her a precise understanding of how these things worked and how they failed. A document could be authentic, could be legally sound, could be exactly what it claimed to be, and still be set aside by a court that had not been properly prepared to receive it. The 3 surveys from 1931 had been in the county record for nearly 80 years. They had been the basis for tax assessments, mortgage filings, property transfers, estate proceedings. Challenging them required more than an original deed and the word of a retired records clerk. It required documentation that could withstand professional scrutiny. She needed someone who could provide that documentation. She called Dr. Ada Okonkwo at Penn State on a Thursday morning from her apartment in Doylestown. She had come across Ada's work 2 years earlier while helping a neighbor with a title dispute, a law review article on forensic analysis of historical land documents that had been precise and methodical and written without any of the hedging that academic writing usually employed when the conclusions were uncomfortable. She had kept the reference in her files. Ada answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting while Maggie described what she had found. When Maggie finished, Ada asked 3 questions: the date on the deed, the county of recording, and whether the original document was parchment or paper stock. Then she said she could see the materials the following week. Maggie drove to State College on a Monday morning with the deed and the 7 letters in an archival sleeve she had purchased at the office supply store, the coffee can, in her bag, because she was still not ready to leave it behind. Ada's laboratory was on the 3rd floor of the Earth Sciences Building, a working space, the surfaces occupied by equipment and reference materials, the organization of someone who moved between precision instrumentation and historical documents daily, and had arranged the room to accommodate both. She was 52 years old and had the focused directness of a person who had spent her career drawing conclusions from physical evidence and had learned to say what the evidence said without softening it for the audience. She examined the deed first. She worked under magnification, the document on the light table, the surface illuminated at an angle that revealed the texture of the paper and the physical character of the ink. Maggie sat at the work table nearby and did not interrupt. Ada said without looking up, "The paper is cotton rag parchment, consistent with Pennsylvania legal document stock from the first quarter of the 20th century. The fiber structure and the surface finish are correct for the period." She moved the magnification to the ink. Iron gall base, the formulation consistent with legal drafting ink used in Pennsylvania county offices in the 1920s. The ink is carbonized at the surface in the pattern of genuine age. She looked at the areas around the letters closely. No evidence of retouching or later addition. She moved to the signature. She had asked Maggie to bring whatever comparative signature material was available for Silas Treadwell. Maggie had gone back to the county records the previous week and had found Silas's marriage license application from 1912, his signature clear on the document. Ada placed the 1912 signature beside the 1927 deed signature under the comparison microscope. Same hand. She said it without hesitation. The letter formation, the pressure distribution, the angle of the downstrokes consistent across a 15-year span. The 1927 signature shows slightly more deliberate letter placement than the 1912 signature, which is consistent with a man who understood the legal weight of what he was signing. She turned to the letters. She worked through the handwriting comparison between the letters and the deed signature systematically, letter by letter. The pen pressure, the specific idiosyncrasies of a hand that wrote infrequently and had developed its own consistent deviations from standard form. The early letters matched the deed signature closely. The final letter, June 1947, showed a reduction in the steadiness of the pen pressure and a slight enlargement of the letter forms consistent, she said, with diminished fine motor control in an aging person with cardiac illness. He wrote these over 16 years. The physical evidence of the writing confirms the timeline. She set the letters aside and examined the county seal. She had pulled the county's notarial records from 1927 from the State Archive database and had the reference images on her screen. She compared the watermark in the deed's paper visible under the light table and the embossed seal impression against the reference records. Consistent. The watermark matches county document stock. The seal matches the notarial press in use in Bucks County in 1927. She removed her safety glasses and set them on the table. She looked at Maggie. "The deed is authentic," she said. "The letters are authentic. The signature is Silas Treadwell's. The county seal is genuine. And the 3 surveys conducted by Edgar Poole in 1931, I pulled those records from the county database before you arrived. All 3 establish boundary descriptions that are inconsistent with the boundary descriptions in this deed." She paused, not for effect. the pause of a scientist making certain the next sentence was exactly right before she said it. In Pennsylvania, property law and original recorded deed takes precedence over subsequent surveys when the surveys contradict the deed's boundary descriptions, particularly when those surveys were conducted by the same person at the same time for 3 adjacent landowners. The legal term for what Poole did is fraudulent survey. The surveys do not extinguish the original deed. The original deed extinguishes them. Maggie said, "What does that mean for the land?" Ada said it means that the 87 acres recorded as belonging to the Whitfield, Carver, and Driscoll parcels since 1931 are not legally those families' land. They have never been legally those families' land. Every transaction involving those acres, every mortgage, every sale, every estate transfer across 3 generations was conducted on a defective title. The original deed to 340 acres was never superseded. It has been sitting in that coffee can, establishing legal priority for the last 80 years. The laboratory was quiet. Maggie sat with the authentication report Ada had begun printing and looked at the deed in its archival sleeve on the table and thought about Nellie Treadwell walking past the pantry wall every morning for 58 years, paying her taxes on 253 acres with money orders from the post office, casting the single opposing vote at the township meeting in 1955, writing the careful letter to the county court in 1963 that had been stamped received and never answered. She picked up the authentication report and put it in the cap with the deed and the letters. She shook Ada's hand and thanked her and walked out of the building into the December evening. The snow from earlier in the week had been packed down on the walkways and was reflecting the light from the building entrance and the parking lot lamps. She stood under the nearest lamp for a moment. She took out her phone. She dialed the number she had looked up that afternoon. The line connected Bucks County Court of Common Pleas Records Division. Maggie said, "I need to file an original property deed from 1927 for the Treadwell parcel in Upper Bucks County. I have a forensic authentication report. I will be there when you open tomorrow morning." She put the phone in her pocket and stood for another moment in the lamplight with the deed and the letters and the authentication report in her bag. Nellie had tried once, in 1963, with a letter that had been stamped and filed and not answered. Maggie was going to try with rather more than a letter. She drove to Doylestown the following morning with the deed and Ada's authentication report in a manila envelope and the 7 letters in their archival sleeve. The Land Records office opened at 8:30. She was there at 8:15, standing on the sidewalk in the December cold, with her coat buttoned to the collar, the envelope under her arm. The clerk who opened the door recognized her immediately, a woman in her 30s who had started in the office 2 years before Maggie retired, and who looked at her now with the particular expression of someone trying to calculate what a former colleague's presence at opening time might mean. Maggie said good morning and asked to file an original deed. The filing took 45 minutes. The clerk reviewed the document, confirmed the county seal, and the notarial certification entered it into the recording system, and stamped it, received with the current date the date that would now appear in the chain of title as the date the original 1927 deed had been formally re-entered into the active record. Maggie signed the filing form and took her copy and walked out into the December morning. Pennsylvania law required notification to all parties with recorded interests in affected parcels within 10 business days. Leland Whitfield called on the 4th day. She had expected the call. She had thought carefully about how she would handle it and had decided that the same approach she had used in 41 years of records work was the right one: state what the documents say, do not editorialize, let the evidence speak. His voice was controlled and exact, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years in legal practice and had learned to manage his responses before they reached his mouth. He said, "Mrs. Holloway, I am not certain what you believe you are doing, but my family has lived on that land since 1932. My great-grandfather purchased it legally. I have documentation." She said, "You have the Poole survey from 1931. I have the original deed from 1927. In Pennsylvania, the original deed takes precedence over subsequent surveys when the surveys contradict the deed's boundary descriptions. You know that, Mr. Whitfield." A pause. He said, "I want to meet with you. Bring the deed to my office tomorrow." The office of Whitfield and Associates occupied the second floor of a building on the main street of Doylestown Conference Room, with floor-to-ceiling windows, cherry wood table, the accumulated signals of a successful practice. Leland was in a gray suit, the kind of suit that was chosen carefully enough to look effortless. He was not alone. Beth Carver sat at the far end of the table, 61 years old, the chat of Raymond Carver, a woman who had grown up in the farmhouse her family had built on land, the 1931 pool survey, described as theirs. She had the look of someone who had driven a long way on short notice and had not slept well. Dennis Driscoll sat beside her, 55, the chat of Lester Driscoll, the kind of practical physical competence that came from running a business with his hands. He had his arms crossed, and his expression was the expression of a man who had decided to be difficult before he understood what he was being difficult about. Leland's personal attorney sat to his right, a legal pad open. Maggie sat across from them and set the envelope on the table and the archival sleeve beside it. She did not say anything. She opened the envelope and placed the deed in the center of the table, and then Ada's authentication report beside it, and then the 7 letters in their sequence. Leland picked up the deed first. He read it with the attention of a lawyer reading a document, not skimming, reading. She watched him work through the property description, the boundary notations, the acreage. He turned to the final page and read the signature and the county seal and the notarial certification. He set it down and picked up Ada's report. He read it more slowly than the deed. The forensic analysis, the comparative signature work, the paper and ink authentication, the legal analysis of how Pennsylvania precedent treated original deeds versus subsequent surveys. He read the conclusion paragraph twice. He set the report down and picked up the letters. He read the first one, September 1931, Silas describing the discovery of the 3 fraudulent surveys and his visits to each of the 3 men. He read the second, March 1932, Raymond Carver's fence going up 40 feet inside the Treadwell property. He read through to the 5th letter, May 1941, August Whitfield arriving at the Treadwell farm and offering $300 for 20 acres of land he had already recorded as his own. Silas refusing. August's face going white. Leland stopped at this letter. He read it again, a second time, a third. Then he set it on the table, not with anger, with the particular quality of a man setting something down because he needed his hands to be empty for a moment. He said, "I have lived on that land for 59 years. My father grew up there. My grandfather built the barn that is still standing." He paused. "And you were telling me that my great-grandfather went to a farm where a man was struggling through the Depression and offered him $300 for land that had already been taken from him on paper." Maggie said yes. The room was quiet. Beth Carver was looking at the letter. She had not picked it up, but she could see the handwriting from where she sat, the careful, deliberate script of a man writing for a reader who would find it years after he was gone. She pressed her fingers against her eyes and did not speak. Dennis Driscoll uncrossed his arms. He put both hands flat on the table. Then he made a fist with his right hand and brought it down on the table surface, not hard enough to be violent, hard enough to mean something. He said 80 years. "We have been paying taxes on that land for 80 years. He was not saying it to Maggie. He was saying it to the room. Leland looked at Maggie. He said, "I want a week before this goes public. I need to speak with my family." Maggie said, "You have a week." Then she said, "I want to tell you what I am going to propose to the court. Not what I am demanding, what I am proposing." She told them, no financial claim against any of the 3 families, no eviction, no forced sale, no legal proceeding that would displace anyone from their homes. Nellie Treadwell had died without heirs. The land would revert to the county under Pennsylvania intestate law. Maggie intended to petition the county to designate the full 340 acres, all of it, including the land the 3 families currently occupied, as the Treadwell Agricultural Heritage Preserve. The families could remain. Their homes and outbuildings would be protected under the preservation designation. But the land on the official record would carry the Treadwell name. Not Whitfield, not Carver, not Driscoll. Treadwell. Leland looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. 1 week later, the Bucks County Herald ran the story on the front page of the local section. "Lost deed found in coffee. Can Rewrite's Three Family Legacies. The opening sentence: for 80 years, three of the most prominent families in Bucks County lived on land that was not legally theirs, and none of them knew it until a retired records clerk found a rusted coffee can behind a loose brick in a farmhouse pantry. Leland Whitfield just learned that 4 generations of his family's legacy was built on land that wasn't theirs. If you were him, what would you do? Leave your answer below. The court ruling came on a Thursday morning in February. Maggie was not in the courtroom. She had made this decision deliberately in the same way she had made most of the decisions in this process, by thinking carefully about what each action meant and what it was for. She had found the deed and authenticated it and filed it, and made the case to the 3 families and proposed the resolution. That work was done. The courtroom belonged to the lawyers and the judge and the formal machinery of a system she had spent 41 years inside, and her presence there would not change the outcome and was not required for the outcome to mean what it meant. She sat on the bench outside the County Historical Library, the same building where she had found Nellie's unanswered 1963 letter in the 4th box, and waited. The authentication had held. Ada's report had been submitted to the court and reviewed by the county's own forensic document examiner, who had confirmed its conclusions without qualification. The 3 pool surveys from 1931 had been examined by the same examiner and found to contain boundary descriptions inconsistent with the original deed, inconsistencies that, in the examiner's professional opinion, could not be the result of measurement error and were consistent with deliberate alteration. Edgar Poole had been dead since 1959. The 3 men who hired him had been dead for decades. The legal question was not who had committed the fraud that was settled by the physical evidence, but what the law required to happen as a consequence of it. Pennsylvania law, it turned out, was clear. Her phone rang at 10:47. It was the clerk she had spoken with when she filed the deed. She listened. She said thank you. She ended the call and sat for a moment on the bench looking at the bare winter trees along the library's front walk. The original deed had been confirmed as the controlling document of record. The 3 pool surveys had been voided as inconsistent with the original boundary descriptions. All 340 acres had been legally reconstituted as a single parcel under the name Silas Treadwell, registered owner. The parcel had then been formally transferred to the Bucks County Land Trust under the conservation designation Maggie had petitioned for, with the condition that the designation be permanent and the name be maintained in perpetuity. Leland Whitfield had not appealed. She had learned this from the clerk before the final ruling. Leland had called his lawyer 3 days after their meeting at the conference room and had instructed him not to contest the filing. Beth Carver had not contested it. Dennis Driscoll had taken 4 days, and then he too had called his attorney and said the same thing. She had not expected this, and then thinking about it had understood it. The letters. Not the deed. The deed was a legal instrument, and legal instruments could be fought. But Silas's 7 letters written across 16 years from 1931 to 1947 had described specific acts by specific named men in specific detail. August Whitfield's face going white at the farm gate. Raymond Carver's fence going up 40 feet inside the wrong line. Lester Driscoll's funeral where everyone called him a pillar of the community. These were not allegations. They were a record written by a man who understood he was writing for posterity, who had described what he witnessed with the precision of a person who could not afford to exaggerate and knew it. The 3 descendants had sat at Leland's conference table and had read those letters and had understood perhaps for the first time what their families had done, not abstractly, not as a legal summary, but in the specific human detail of a man standing at a kitchen window watching his boundary disappear 40 feet at a time and not saying anything because he had no money and no lawyer and knew that saying something would only make things worse. You could fight a deed in court. You could not fight the look on August Whitfield's face when he was told the land wasn't his to buy. The 3 families had signed the 99-year lease agreements with the county the previous week, $1 per year per family. The terms allowed them to remain in their homes and maintain their outbuildings and continue to use the land as they had been using it. What changed was the official record. On paper in the county registry and every subsequent transaction and assessment and historical reference, the land was the Treadwell Agricultural Heritage Preserve. Not Whitfield, not Carver, not Driscoll. Treadwell. Maggie drove to the cemetery in the afternoon. The Methodist churchyard was small, the older section at the back, near the stone wall, the markers modest and close together in the way of rural Pennsylvania burial grounds that had been filling up since the 18th century. She had found Nellie's plot location in the church records. 3rd row from the back east side. The stone was simple granite, the lettering plain and without embellishment. Nellie Treadwell, 1920 to 2007. No scripture, no epitaph. No designation of service or family or anything she had been or done in the 87 years between those two dates. Maggie stood at the grave for a long time in the February cold. She thought about the coffee can, about the loose brick, about the careful way Silas had folded the deed and placed the letters around it and sealed it inside a Maxwell House tin and trusted it to the pantry wall of a farmhouse in Upper Bucks County. About Nellie walking past that wall every morning for 58 years. About the letter to the court in 1963 that had been stamped received and not answered. About a woman in a gray wool sweater standing alone at the baked goods table at the 1964 county fair, holding her handbag close, not smiling, not unhappy, simply present. Waiting in the particular way that people wait when they have done what they can do and can do nothing more for something they no longer expect to see. She reached into her bag and took out the coffee can. She had kept it. Through the filing and the authentication and the meeting at Leland Whitfield's conference table and the court ruling, she had kept it. She had not been able to explain why exactly, except that it seemed important to keep it until the thing it had been holding was done. She set it on the granite marker, the rusted tin against the gray stone, the label still partially visible. Good to the last drop, the irony of it not lost on her, or perhaps not irony at all, perhaps just accuracy. The last drop had been the deed, and the deed had held. She stood in the cold for another moment. Then she said quietly to the stone and the can and the February air, "I found it, Nellie, and I did what you couldn't." She drove back toward Doylestown on the county road and on impulse turned off at the Treadwell Farm Lane. She parked at the end of the drive and sat with the engine running and the heater on, looking at the house through the windshield. The white clapboard, the sagging porch, the bare maple at the southeast corner, the window still dark, the house still empty, the estate sale. No heirs sign was gone from the porch post. In its place, a new sign county issued, the lettering clean on weathered wood. Treadwell Homestead, established 1890, preserved in perpetuity by the Bucks County Land Trust. Maggie sat in the car with the heater running and looked at the sign. She thought about Silas writing in June 1947, "You are the last Treadwell Nellie. What you do with these papers will decide whether the Treadwell name means anything on this land anymore." The name meant something. It was on the sign at the end of the lane, and in the county registry, and in the court order, and in the deed that had spent 58 years in a coffee can behind a brick in a pantry wall waiting for someone to ask the right question. The Treadwell name was on the land. That was what Silas had wanted. That was what Nellie had kept the can for. Not money, not legal victory, not the satisfaction of watching 3 families lose what their grandparents had taken. Just this, the name on the land and the record permanent. Maggie put the car in reverse and drove back down the lane. 6 months after the court ruling, the Bucks County Historical Society opened a small exhibition. The gallery occupied 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of the Society's building in Doylestown, a converted Victorian house that had served as the organization's home since 1947. The rooms modest in scale. The display cases, the practical glass and wood cases of an institution that prioritized the objects over the presentation. The exhibition was called Forgotten Voices of the Upper Bucks Valley. Maggie came on a Wednesday morning. She had declined the invitation to speak at the opening ceremony, had declined politely but firmly when the Society's director called, and had explained that she had nothing to add to what the objects themselves communicated. She had declined the interview requests from the Herald and from a Philadelphia paper that had picked up the story in March. She had given Ada's name when journalists called, and Ada had handled the professional and historical dimensions of the story with the same precision she brought to everything. Maggie had not sought any of this out. She had done the work that needed doing and had expected that the work would be the end of it. The Wednesday morning was quiet, in the way that museums were quiet on weekday mornings, the particular stillness of a space that existed for the occasional visitor, rather than for the continuous crowd, the objects in the cases holding their positions patiently between one person and the next. She found the central case in the second room. The coffee can was in the center of the case. The lid was propped open beside it, at a slight angle, the rusted interior visible the space where the deed and the letters had been for 58 years, now empty and sealed behind UV protective glass. The can had been cleaned lightly. The rust preserved the structural condition stabilized, but nothing polished or altered from the state in which Maggie had found it in the pantry wall. Good to the last drop, the lettering still visible in sections through the oxidation. The deed was to the right of the can, open flat and displayed under the same protective glass, the 1927 parchment, the boundary descriptions, the Bucks County seal, Silas Treadwell's signature, and the careful hand of a man who understood what he was signing. The 7 letters were arranged in sequence to the left, each one open to its first page, the dates visible 1931, 1932, 1934, 1941, 1947. The description card in the lower right corner of the case read, "For 58 years, Nellie Treadwell kept the original deed to her family's 340-acre property inside this coffee can, concealed behind a loose brick in her kitchen pantry. She never told anyone. She died in 2007 without knowing whether anyone would find it." In 2026, Margaret Holloway, a retired Bucks County land records clerk, found it during a routine estate inventory. Her discovery reestablished legal ownership of the Treadwell parcel and restored 340 acres to public trust as a permanent agricultural heritage preserve. Maggie stood in front of the case and read the description card. She had read the draft when the Society's curator sent it to her for review. She had suggested 2 changes, the word routine, which she had asked to be removed because it was not accurate, and a line crediting Ada Okonkwo's forensic work, which she had asked to be added. The curator had accepted both changes. She was still reading the card when she heard footsteps. A young woman in her late 20s, the lanyard of a staff member around her neck, stopped beside her. "Do you know this story?" the woman asked. She said it the way museum staff said it, the opening of an offer to explain, not an assumption of ignorance. Maggie said yes. "I am the one who found the coffee can." The woman looked at her for a moment and then said, "Would you like to sit down?" They sat on the bench in front of the case, Maggie and the young woman, the display between them and the window, the February light outside coming through the glass. The woman had a small notebook, not for documentation, but the kind people carried when they wanted to remember things. She did not open it. She sat with it in her lap and listened. Maggie did not talk about the finding. She had told that story enough times in the months since the court ruling, and the finding was in the description card, and in the Herald article, and in Ada's paper, which had been accepted for publication in the spring. What she talked about was Nellie. She talked about the property tax records, 55 years of money orders, always on time, never late. She talked about the single opposing vote at the 1955 township meeting. She talked about the letter to the court in 1963, the careful, precise letter from a woman who did not write letters often, and had written this one with great care. She talked about the stamp in red ink received, March 17, 1963, and the absence of any reply. She said, "I worked in that office for 41 years. I know how the system worked. A letter from a woman in a farmhouse in Buckingham Township asking about the cost of contesting an 80-year-old survey would have landed on the desk of a clerk who had 20 other things to do and no particular reason to prioritize it. Not malice, not corruption, just the ordinary arithmetic of a bureaucracy that was not designed to look for the people it missed," the young woman said. But Nellie kept the can anyway. Maggie looked at the case. At the coffee can with its rusted surface and its partially visible label sitting in the center of a museum case with UV protective glass and a climate control system preserved with considerably more care than it had received in the pantry wall. She said Nellie tried once. When nothing came back, she went home. She did not throw the can away. She did not move. It did not change what she had done with it, did not do anything that would suggest she had given up on the possibility that it might eventually matter. She just kept it for 44 more years after that letter. The woman said, "Do you think she believed someone would find it?" Maggie considered this for a moment. She said, "I think she believed it was possible. And I think she understood that possible was the most she had. She could not make it probable. She did not have the resources to make it probable, but she could keep the thing that made it possible, and she did." The young woman nodded and wrote something in her notebook. Then she asked Mrs. Holloway, "Why did you do this? You had no legal stake in that deed. You're not a Treadwell. You were there to inventory an estate, not to investigate it." Maggie looked at the case, the coffee can, the deed. The 7 letters in their sequence, Silas's handwriting visible through the glass at this distance, the particular deliberate script of a man writing for a reader he would never meet. She said because there are things that get hidden, not because they have no value, but because no one has asked the right question yet. And I know how to ask. There are things hidden not because they have no value, but because no one asked the right question. If this story moved you, press like. It helps the next hidden truth find the person who needs to hear it. The ceremony at Treadwell Homestead was held on a Saturday afternoon in late April. The Bucks County Land Trust had organized it simply and on purpose, no podium, no amplification, no program printed on cardstock. A gathering of perhaps 40 people on the south lawn of the farmhouse, the kind of afternoon that Pennsylvania occasionally produced in late April as a kind of apology for the winter warm, without being hot the light at a low angle that made everything look considered the fields around the property, showing the first sustained green of the season. Maggie arrived early and stood at the edge of the drive. The farmhouse looked different in the spring, not better or worse, different the way all old structures look different when the season changed and the light changed with it. The white clapboard still needed work. The porch still sagged at the east end. But the maple at the southeast corner had leafed out fully and was casting the particular dappled shadow of a mature deciduous tree in new growth, and the kitchen garden along the south foundation showed the first evidence of what the caretaker the land trust had hired was beginning to do with it. She saw Leland Whitfield arrive. He came alone without his attorney in the same gray suit he had worn to the conference room meeting in the winter. He parked at the far end of the drive and walked toward the gathering without stopping to speak to anyone. He took a position near the back of the informal crowd, his hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at the farmhouse with the expression of a man trying to understand something. He had been living inside without understanding for a very long time. Beth Carver arrived a few minutes later with a woman Maggie assumed was a daughter. Dennis Driscoll came last with a teenage boy who had the look of a grandson brought along because it seemed like the appropriate thing to do. The 3 of them did not stand together. They positioned themselves at different points around the gathering with the careful spacing of people who shared a complicated history and had not yet negotiated how to be in the same place with it. The land trust director said a few words about conservation easements and the legal history of the parcel and the long process that had led to this designation. Maggie had been asked to speak and had declined. Ada had been asked and had sent a written statement that was read aloud 3 sentences about the forensic work and what it had established precise and formal and exactly right. Then the director walked to the fence post at the entrance of the drive, where a piece of cloth had been draped over something, and invited Francis, the Land Trust Board member, who had shepherded the designation through the county process, to remove the cloth. The brass plate underneath was simple, the lettering clean and readable from 20 feet. Treadwell Homestead, established 1890, preserved in perpetuity for the public good, in memory of Silas and Nellie Treadwell. The small crowd applauded. Maggie did not applaud. She stood at the edge of the gathering and looked at the plate and at the farmhouse behind it and at the 340 acres of fields and tree lines and old fence rows that stretched away from the house in every direction. No Whitfield on the plate, no Carver, no Driscoll. Not because they were being punished, they were still there, still living on the land under the 99-year agreements, still maintaining the houses their families had built. But the record said Treadwell. The official designation said Treadwell. The thing that would persist after every current living person was gone said Treadwell. That was the correction Silas had been trying to make from 1931 to his death in 1952. That was what Nellie had kept the coffee can for. Not the return of the land to private Treadwell ownership. There was no Treadwell left to own it. The return of the name to the land. The restoration of the record. She walked east along the property line after the formal portion of the ceremony ended. The eastern boundary was where the first of the pool surveys had shifted the line, the survey that had moved the boundary 30 feet into Treadwell land, along its full length absorbing the strip that had become the eastern edge of the Whitfield property. The survey that Raymond Carver had made real in a physical sense by putting up his new fence posts in 1932, 40 feet inside the wrong line. The fence posts were gone. The Land Trust had removed the old fence line as part of the conservation work, returning the boundary to the original deed description. What marked the eastern edge of the Treadwell parcel now was what had always marked it before the surveys, the line of old oak trees that had been growing along that boundary since before Silas Treadwell's father had first farmed the land. They were large trees, the kind of large that spoke to 100 years or more of growth, the trunks, 3 feet across the canopy, dense and still. They had been standing on the correct boundary line since before the surveys and had continued standing on the correct boundary line after the surveys, indifferent to what the paper said about where the line was. Maggie stood beside the nearest oak and looked back toward the farmhouse. The late afternoon light came across the fields at a long angle, the kind of light that made the grass look intentional and the old fence rows look like composition. The farmhouse at the center of the view, the new brass plate at the entrance catching the light when the angle was right. Treadwell Homestead. She thought about Silas writing at a kitchen table in 1931, beginning a letter he expected to be read after his death. She thought about Nellie at 27 years old, receiving a coffee can from her father and a promise that what was inside it was the truth. She thought about 58 years of money orders at the post office and $12 a week at Henderson's and a single vote against a road extension and a careful letter that was stamped received and not answered. She thought about a loose brick in a pantry wall. Silas had written, "I cannot give you the land they took, but I can give you the truth." He had been right about what the truth was worth nothing to anyone who did not know how to read it, and right that someone would eventually know how to read it. He had been wrong only about one thing he had written, that Nellie would know what to do. Nellie had known. She had tried once in 1963, and the system had not answered. And then she had gone home and continued to walk past the pantry wall every morning for 44 more years, keeping the can behind the brick, not throwing it away, not moving it, not giving up the possibility, even when she had no mechanism left to act on it. That was not failure. That was the specific form of persistence available to a person who had been told by the silence of an unanswered letter that the system was not going to help her, and who had refused to let the refusal be the final answer. She had waited for someone to ask the right question. Maggie had asked it. She walked back toward the farmhouse in the late afternoon light. Silas Treadwell wrote in his last letter in 1947, "I cannot give you the land they took, but I can give you the truth." For 58 years, Nellie Treadwell kept that truth in a rusted coffee can behind a loose brick. She never opened it, but she never threw it away either. She waited, not because she was weak, but because she knew someday someone would ask the right question. The land is preserved now. The name is on the gate, and in the county museum, the Maxwell House coffee can that anyone else would have thrown away is the most important object in the local history collection. Silas was right. The truth is worth nothing to anyone who does not know how to read it. And Nellie waited long enough. There are more old houses with unanswered questions inside them. The next one is in the playlist right here.